In 1941, Detroit's factories roared, churning out trucks that crossed oceans to battlefields. The United States, awakened by Pearl Harbor, unleashed its industrial giant. By 1943, American plants collectively produced more than 200,000 trucks annually, dwarfing Germany's output of 52,000 that year. The Lend-Lease Act, signed in March 1941, funneled 600,000 vehicles of all types to Allies by 1945, ranged 300 miles on standard fuel. Britain's desert convoys and Soviet offensives leaned on these machines, their standardized parts ensuring repairs in hours. Germany, stretched across Europe, scavenged mismatched spares, their trucks faltering under shortages. The constraint was production. America's assembly lines surged. Germany's peaked before late-war bombings halved output. On the Eastern Front, Soviet drivers marveled at Studebaker reliability, hauling 3 tons through mud without stalling. In North Africa, British mechanics swapped GMC parts under fire, cursing captured Axis wrecks. The number that matters is 600,000 vehicles, a metric sustaining Allied momentum across fronts. This flood of mobility shaped battles, letting Allies strike, while Axis forces limped. The Allied war machine rolled on American steel, fueled by relentless supply chains. By 1942, Lend-Lease delivered 150,000 Studebaker trucks to the Soviet Union alone, typical operational ranges on the order of 240 miles with standard loads. These vehicles, paired with 2,000 locomotives, rebuilt Soviet rail networks, moving the vast majority of Red Army supplies across frozen steppes. British forces in North Africa relied heavily on Commonwealth CMP trucks and Lend-Lease United States types, including GMCs, their interchangeable parts enabling repairs under desert sun. The constraint was standardization. American designs prioritized simplicity, cutting downtime to hours. In contrast, Germany's 52,000 trucks in 1943, scattered across fronts, lacked unified parts. Mechanics patched Opel Blitz wrecks with scavenged bolts. Fuel shortages bit harder. Allied air raids slashed German synthetic oil output to a fraction of early 1944 levels, over 90% down by September. Soviet offensives, like Operation Bagration, exploited this, smashing 28 German divisions in Belarus with American-supplied mobility. German commanders watched horse-drawn carts replace their panzer columns, supply lines crumbling under partisan raids. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, keeping Allies moving while Germany stalled. The war's pulse beat through the hands of mechanics and drivers, their tools and grit bridging the gap between factories and front lines. Across deserts, steppes, and bombed-out roads, Allied forces leaned on American-supplied vehicles, well over 600,000 by 1945, to outmaneuver a faltering enemy. In North Africa, British mechanics toiled under canvas shelters, swapping axles on Commonwealth CMP trucks and Lend-Lease GMCs, vehicles with typical operational ranges on the order of a few hundred miles under average loads. Standardized parts cut repair times to under 3 hours. In 1942, British workshops near El Alamein restored dozens of damaged vehicles in 1 week, rolling them back to Montgomery's 8th Army for the decisive push against Rommel. The constraint was speed. Allied logistics demanded mobility, and American designs delivered it with interchangeable components. Soviet drivers on the Eastern Front, navigating rutted tracks in 1943, hauled 3-ton loads in Studebaker trucks, their engines enduring harsh conditions without frequent breakdowns. These men, often barely trained, kept Red Army spearheads fed during the Kursk counteroffensive, where Soviet forces shattered German lines. Germany's logistics, meanwhile, unraveled under strain. In 1943, the Reich fielded 52,000 trucks, but non-standardized parts meant a single breakdown could idle a vehicle for days. A German mechanic in Ukraine, surrounded by Opel Blitz carcasses, might wait a week for a specific gear from Berlin, if it arrived at all. By 1944, Allied air raids had crippled Germany's supply arteries, reducing synthetic oil output to less than 10% of January's yield by September. Fuel shortages forced commanders to abandon mechanized units for horse-drawn carts. In Normandy, panzer divisions reported many vehicles immobile, not from combat but from lack of spares and gasoline. The human toll was stark. German drivers, exhausted by endless scavenging, pushed trucks beyond their limits, only to watch engines seize in the mud. Repair times stretched to 72 hours for basic fixes. Soviet and British crews, by contrast, kept rolling, their American-supplied fleets backed by crates of ready parts shipped across the Atlantic. The Soviet experience underscored this divide. By war's end, 152,000 Studebaker trucks, delivered via Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor, became the backbone of Red Army logistics. A driver on the Leningrad front could load 3 tons of ammunition and cover 200 miles before nightfall. 2,000 American locomotives, paired with these trucks, ensured the vast majority of supplies reached forward positions, even as blizzards buried roads. During Operation Bagration in 1944, Soviet forces moved 1 million men and thousands of tons of materiel across Belarus, crushing 28 German divisions in weeks. The Red Army's mobility, fueled by Lend-Lease, turned static fronts into routes. German troops, watching their own supply lines collapse, resorted to looting villages for fuel, only to find watered-down kerosene. A Wehrmacht logistics officer in Minsk, his trucks stranded, burned records to avoid capture as Soviet T-34 seconds closed in. In the West, British and American forces mirrored this momentum. In 1944, the Normandy campaign saw Allied armies deploy 100,000 vehicles, including 30,000 jeeps, each capable of a few hundred miles on a single tank. A United States Army mechanic in Cherbourg, working by lantern light, could rebuild a GMC engine in 10 hours, using parts from a crate stamped Detroit. These trucks carried 300,000 tons of supplies, from beachheads to Patton's Third Army, enabling a breakout that encircled German forces at Falaise. German commanders, their own vehicles stalled, marveled at Allied convoys stretching miles, untouched by fuel shortages. By August 1944, the Wehrmacht lost 2,000 trucks in France alone, abandoned for want of oil or axles. The constraint was adaptability. Allied mechanics, armed with standardized tools, kept fleets moving. German workshops, choked by bureaucracy, buried theirs in paperwork. The human perspective revealed the war's grinding reality. A Soviet driver, frostbitten but determined, coaxed his Studebaker through a blizzard to deliver shells to a battery under siege. A British mechanic, hands burned by hot metal, cursed as he wrestled a jeep's suspension back to life under German artillery fire. These men, often anonymous, were the sinew of Allied logistics, their endurance amplifying American industrial might. Germany's workforce, by contrast, faced despair. A Luftwaffe ground crew in 1944, tasked with fueling Messerschmitts, siphoned diesel from broken-down trucks, only to be grounded by empty tanks. The Reich's overextended empire, spanning 2,000 miles from Norway to North Africa, buckled as sabotage and bombings severed rail lines. Partisan attacks in Yugoslavia destroyed hundreds of German trucks in 1943, each loss a wound that could not heal. The turning point came in 1944, as Allied offensives synchronized across continents. German generals cursed endless Allied convoys, their own tanks idle without fuel. In Belarus, Normandy, and Italy, American-supplied vehicles powered breakthroughs, exploiting Germany's immobility. The myth of Nazi engineering superiority crumbled as Studebakers outlasted Panzers and Jeeps outran Opel Blitzes. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a lifeline that kept Allied armies surging while Germany's logistics bled out. This was not just a war of steel but of systems. American standardization and production outpaced German improvisation, turning human effort into decisive momentum. The war's momentum shifted irreversibly in 1944, as Allied logistics, powered by American industry, overwhelmed Germany's crumbling supply lines. Well over 600,000 vehicles, delivered through Lend-Lease by 1945, gave Allied forces unmatched mobility, their typical operational ranges on the order of a few hundred miles under average loads. In Normandy, American and British armies roared forward, their tens of thousands of vehicles carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies from beachheads to the front. A United States Army driver, weaving a GMC through hedgerows, could deliver supplies to Patton's tanks within hours, often covering 150 miles without stalling. Standardized parts, shipped in crates from Detroit, ensured repairs took mere hours. A Jeep's axle could be swapped by lantern light. The constraint was endurance. Allied supply chains stretched thousands of miles but never snapped, thanks to American production. By contrast, Germany produced 52,000 trucks in 1943, their non-standardized components forcing mechanics to cannibalize wrecks for parts. The Eastern Front told a grimmer story for the Reich. By war's end, 152,000 Studebaker trucks bolstered Soviet logistics, each rated for 2.5 tons off-road, often overloaded beyond rating. 2,000 American locomotives, paired with these vehicles, moved the vast majority of Red Army supplies, enabling offensives that shattered German defenses. In Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, Soviet forces surged across Belarus with well over 1 million personnel and massive tonnages of materiel, annihilating 28 German divisions in weeks. A Soviet driver, eyes fixed on icy roads, kept his Studebaker rolling for 200 miles to supply T-34 seconds, his cargo intact despite German airstrikes. Repair times averaged hours for minor damage. German logistics, however, buckled under the onslaught. By mid-1944, Allied air raids had slashed synthetic oil production to less than 10% of January's output by September. Fuel shortages forced commanders to abandon mechanized units for horse-drawn carts. A panzer division in Ukraine reported many vehicles immobile, not from battle, but from fuel and spare shortages. German mechanics, surrounded by broken Opel Blitzes, waited days for parts that never came, their workshops reduced to salvage yards. The human cost of Germany's collapse was stark. In 1944, a Wehrmacht driver in Poland, rationed to minimal fuel, abandoned his truck after it seized in sub-zero cold. Horse-drawn carts, relics of a bygone era, replaced mechanized units, slowing German retreats to a crawl. Partisan attacks compounded the chaos, destroying hundreds of trucks in Yugoslavia alone during 1943, each loss bleeding the Reich's mobility. Sabotage and bombings severed rail lines, sharply reducing Germany's transport capacity by late 1944. A Luftwaffe crew, tasked with refueling fighters, siphoned diesel from grounded vehicles, only to watch their planes remain idle. The constraint was resources. Germany's empire, spanning 2,000 miles, could not sustain its armies without oil, steel, or rubber. Allied bombing campaigns, like the Combined Bomber Offensive, targeted refineries and factories, ensuring the Reich's production never recovered. Synthetic fuel output dropped sharply by September 1944. In the West, Allied logistics shone brighter. During the Normandy breakout, American trucks moved very large tonnages of ammunition to the front in July 1944, enabling Patton's Third Army to encircle German forces at Falaise. A United States Army mechanic in Cherbourg, hands blackened by grease, rebuilt a GMC engine in 10 hours, using parts from a crate stamped Detroit. British forces, bolstered by Commonwealth CMP trucks and Lend-Lease GMCs, maintained convoys that stretched miles, their vehicles repaired within hours thanks to standardized designs. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a lifeline that kept Allied armies surging while Germany's faltered. In Italy, Allied troops pushed through mountainous terrain, their jeeps navigating trails where German trucks bogged down. A British driver, dodging shellfire near Cassino, delivered medical supplies in a jeep that ran a few hundred miles on a single tank, its engine purring despite dust and heat. Germany's logistical death spiral was evident in small, brutal details. In 1944, a Wehrmacht logistics officer in Minsk burned records as Soviet tanks closed in, his trucks abandoned for lack of fuel. Repair times for German vehicles stretched to days for basic fixes, as parts shortages crippled workshops. By August, the Wehrmacht lost thousands of trucks in France, left to rust for want of oil or axles. Allied air superiority, enabled by American-supplied fuel and aircraft, hammered German supply lines, grounding Luftwaffe squadrons and stalling panzer columns. A German commander in Normandy, watching Allied convoys roll unopposed, cursed his own tanks, idle without gasoline. The myth of Nazi engineering collapsed as American standardization, simple, scalable, and relentless, outpaced Germany's over-engineered designs. Studebakers outlasted panzers, jeeps outran Opel Blitzes. The turning point was not one battle, but a season. Summer 1944, when synchronized Allied offensives in Belarus, Normandy, and Italy exploited Germany's immobility. The human perspective grounded this shift. A Soviet driver, frostbitten but resolute, coaxed his Studebaker through a blizzard to deliver shells to a besieged artillery unit. A United States Army mechanic, sweat-soaked in Normandy's heat, cursed as he wrestled a truck's suspension back to life under German sniper fire. These men, often unsung, were the backbone of Allied logistics, their labor amplifying American industrial might. Germany's workforce, by contrast, faced despair. A Luftwaffe ground crew in 1944, tasked with servicing Messerschmitts, scavenged fuel from broken-down trucks, only to be grounded by empty tanks. The Reich's overextended supply lines, battered by partisan raids and Allied bombs, could not sustain its armies. In Belarus, Soviet forces captured thousands of German vehicles, many abandoned with empty tanks or seized engines, their drivers fled or dead. The inflection point was clear by August 1944. Allied logistics, fueled by American production, turned potential stalemates into routes. In Normandy, the Falaise pocket trapped 50,000 German troops, their escape blocked by fuel-starved vehicles. In Belarus, Operation Bagration obliterated Army Group Center, leaving German commanders scrambling for horses. The constraint was not just fuel, but systems. American standardization ensured Allied vehicles stayed operational, while Germany's patchwork logistics collapsed under pressure. A German general in France, staring at stalled panzers, muttered, "Their trucks never stop, ours never start." This was a war of attrition, and America's industrial engine, churning out well over 600,000 vehicles, tipped the scales. Allied drivers and mechanics, backed by Detroit's output, kept the front lines fluid, while Germany's forces, tethered to dying supply lines, withered. The legacy of this collapse was immediate. By late 1944, Germany's ability to wage mechanized war was broken. Allied forces, from the Rhine to the Vistula, pressed forward, their trucks and jeeps rolling over roads littered with Axis wrecks. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a metric that defined Allied mobility and Germany's defeat. This was not a war of heroics alone, but of systems, where American production and Allied endurance outmatched German ambition, leaving the Reich's armies stranded in the wreckage of their own logistics. By late 1944, Germany's war machine lay in tatters, its logistics shattered under Allied pressure. Well over 600,000 vehicles, supplied through Lend-Lease by 1945, powered Allied armies across Europe, their typical operational ranges on the order of a few hundred miles under average loads. In the West, American and British forces surged toward the Rhine, their tens of thousands of trucks and jeeps carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. A United States Army driver in Belgium, navigating snow-packed roads, delivered fuel to Sherman tanks within hours. Standardized parts often enabled rapid field repairs, often within hours, depending on parts, weather, and unit practice. The constraint was scalability. American production sustained Allied momentum, while Germany's supply lines bled out. Germany produced 52,000 trucks in 1943, but by 1945, attrition and shortages left their fleets skeletal, with mechanics scavenging parts from wrecks. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces, bolstered by 152,000 Studebaker trucks by war's end, pressed relentlessly. Rated for 2.5 tons off-road, these trucks, often overloaded, hauled massive tonnages through mud and ice. United States locomotives, numbering 2,000, helped power a rail network that carried the vast majority of Red Army supplies, enabling offensives that crushed German defenses. In January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive saw Soviet armies advance roughly 200 to 300 miles in weeks, with well over 1 million personnel and vast supplies. A Soviet driver, breath-fogging in sub-zero cold, kept his Studebaker rolling to deliver shells to T-34 seconds, covering long distances in a day. Standardized parts enabled rapid field repairs. Germany's logistics, by contrast, collapsed entirely. Allied air raids had reduced synthetic oil production to less than 10% of early 1944 levels by September, and by 1945, fuel was a memory. Wehrmacht units, rationed to minimal gasoline, abandoned thousands of trucks, their engines seized or tanks dry. The human toll of Germany's failure was relentless. In 1945, a Wehrmacht mechanic in Prussia, surrounded by broken Opel Blitzes, hammered mismatched parts in vain, waiting for spares that never arrived. Horse-drawn carts, creaking under artillery loads, slowed German retreats to a crawl, easy prey for Soviet tanks. Partisan raids, destroying hundreds of vehicles in occupied territories during 1943, had compounded the Reich's losses, and by 1945, sabotage crippled what remained. Bombing severed rail lines, slashing transport capacity to a fraction of its peak. A Luftwaffe ground crew, tasked with servicing fighters, stood idle beside empty fuel drums, their planes grounded. The constraint was survival. Germany's empire stretched 2,000 miles, lacked oil, steel, and rubber to sustain its armies. Allied bombing campaigns targeted factories and refineries, ensuring no recovery. Synthetic fuel output dwindled to negligible levels by early 1945. In the West, Allied logistics powered decisive advances. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American trucks rushed very large tonnages of supplies to Bastogne, enabling defenders to hold against German assaults. A United States Army mechanic, hands numb in Ardennes frost, serviced a Jeep suspension using parts from an Army supply crate stamped Detroit. British forces, with Commonwealth CMP trucks and GMCs, maintained convoys that rolled unopposed, their vehicles repaired swiftly thanks to standardized designs. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a lifeline that kept Allied armies fluid while Germany stagnated. In Italy, Allied troops navigated Apennine trails, their jeeps enduring where German trucks faltered. A British driver near Bologna, under shellfire, delivered medical supplies in a jeep that ran a few hundred miles on one tank, its engine steady despite mud and cold. Germany's collapse was etched in desperate acts. In 1945, a Wehrmacht officer in Berlin burned logistics reports as Soviet artillery echoed, his trucks abandoned for lack of fuel. Repair times for German vehicles stretched to days, as workshops lacked parts and tools. By early 1945, thousands of trucks lay scattered across Europe, left for want of oil or axles. Allied air superiority, fueled by American-supplied aviation gasoline, pounded German supply lines, grounding Luftwaffe squadrons and stalling panzer remnants. A German commander in the Ruhr, staring at idle tanks, cursed Allied convoys that never stopped. The myth of Nazi engineering superiority lay in ruins. American standardization, simple, scalable, relentless, outpaced Germany's complex designs. Studebakers outlasted panzers. Jeeps outran Opel blitzes. The turning point, solidified in 1944, culminated in 1945. Allied offensives, from the Vistula to the Rhine, exploited Germany's immobility, turning battles into routes. The human perspective captured the war's brutal asymmetry. A Soviet driver, frostbitten but unyielding, coaxed his Studebaker through a blizzard to supply a besieged unit, his cargo saving a front line. A United States Army mechanic, sweat-soaked in Belgium's chill, cursed as he rebuilt a truck's engine under German mortar fire, keeping Patton's advance alive. These men, often nameless, were the sinew of Allied logistics, their endurance amplifying American industrial might. Germany's workforce faced futility. A Luftwaffe crew in 1945, tasked with fueling Messerschmitts, scavenged diesel from wrecked trucks, only to watch their airfield overrun. The Reich's supply lines, battered by partisans and bombs, collapsed entirely. In Poland, Soviet forces captured thousands of German vehicles, most abandoned with empty tanks or broken axles, their drivers gone or dead. The final inflection came in early 1945. In the east, the Vistula-Oder offensive obliterated German defenses, leaving Army Group Vistula in disarray. In the west, the Rhine crossings trapped thousands of German troops, their escape blocked by fuel-starved vehicles. The constraint was not just fuel, but systems. American standardization kept Allied vehicles operational, while Germany's patchwork logistics disintegrated. A German general in Berlin, staring at stalled panzers, muttered, "Their trucks roll, ours rust." This was a war of attrition, and America's industrial engine churning out well over 600,000 vehicles sealed Germany's fate. Allied drivers and mechanics, backed by Detroit's output, kept front lines fluid, while Germany's forces, chained to broken supply lines, withered. The aftermath was immediate and total. By April 1945, Germany's mechanized war was over. Allied forces, from Berlin to the Elbe, rolled over roads strewn with Axis wrecks. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a metric that defined Allied mobility and Germany's defeat. Soviet armies, fueled by Studebakers, entered Berlin. American and British trucks crossed the Rhine, their engines humming where German tanks lay silent. This was not a war of heroics alone, but of systems. American production and Allied grit outmatched German ambition, leaving the Reich's armies buried in the wreckage of their logistics. The surrender in May 1945 marked the end, a testament to the power of standardized supply chains and the men who kept them moving. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 ended a war defined by logistics as much as battles. Well over 600,000 vehicles, supplied through Lend-Lease by 1945, had carried Allied armies to victory, their typical operational ranges on the order of a few hundred miles, under average loads. Soviet forces rolled into Berlin on Studebaker trucks, while American and British convoys crossed the Rhine, their engines humming over roads littered with German wrecks. The United States, through Lend-Lease, provided $50 billion in aid, including 152,000 trucks to the Soviet Union and tens of thousands to Britain, enabling relentless offensives. Standardized parts allowed rapid field repairs, often within hours, depending on conditions. The constraint was systems. American industrial might, paired with Allied endurance, outpaced Germany's faltering supply chains. Germany's 52,000 trucks produced in 1943 were a fraction of Allied output, and by 1945 most lay abandoned, crippled by fuel and parts shortages. The human effort behind this victory was immense. A Soviet driver, exhausted but resolute, delivered the last crates of ammunition to Berlin's outskirts, his Studebaker enduring where German vehicles failed. A United States Army mechanic in Germany, hands scarred from wrench work, serviced a Jeep with parts from an Army supply crate, stamped Detroit, keeping Patton's lines moving. These men, often overlooked, turned industrial output into battlefield momentum. Germany's workforce, by contrast, faced collapse. A Wehrmacht mechanic in 1945, surrounded by broken Opel Blitzes, abandoned his tools as Soviet tanks approached, his workshop empty of spares. Partisan raids and Allied bombings had severed Germany's rail lines, reducing transport capacity to a fraction by war's end. Synthetic fuel production, negligible by 1945, left Luftwaffe planes grounded and panzer units immobile. The post-war world bore the marks of this logistical triumph. Lend-Lease, supplying 17% of Britain's war materials and 10% of the Soviet Union's, cemented the United States as the arsenal of democracy. Soviet armies, powered by 152,000 Studebaker trucks, occupied Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the Cold War. American and British forces, their convoys unbroken, rebuilt Western Europe, their trucks repurposed for reconstruction. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a metric that not only won the war but shaped its aftermath. Germany's defeat exposed the limits of conquest without sustainable logistics, its armies stranded by a failure to match Allied systems. Repair times for German trucks stretched to days by 1945. The legacy extended beyond materiel. American standardization, simple, scalable designs set a template for post-war industry, influencing global manufacturing. The Soviet Union, retaining thousands of Lend-Lease trucks, built its post-war military on lessons of mobility. Britain, its empire fraying, leaned on American aid to stabilize its economy, with Lend-Lease vehicles aiding recovery efforts. Germany, its factories in ruins, faced years of reconstruction, its logistical collapse a cautionary tale. A British driver, repurposing a GMC for civilian transport in 1946, marveled at its durability, a stark contrast to the Reich's shattered fleets. The war's end revealed a truth. Systems, not just soldiers, won victories, and America's industrial engine had been the decisive force. The final reckoning was clear. Allied logistics, fueled by well over 600,000 vehicles, turned the tide, enabling offensives that Germany could not counter. From Normandy to Berlin, American production and Allied grit overwhelmed an enemy starved of fuel and parts. A German officer, surveying a field of abandoned panzers, muttered, "Their trucks won the war." This was a conflict of attrition, where standardized supply chains and human resilience outmatched ambition. The surrender in May 1945 closed the chapter, but its lessons on production, mobility, and systems reshaped the world, from Cold War divisions to modern industry, proving that logistics could forge empires as surely as armies. Germany's surrender, in May 1945, marked the triumph of Allied logistics over Axis collapse. Well over 600,000 vehicles, supplied through Lend-Lease, powered Allied armies, their typical operational ranges on the order of a few hundred miles under average loads. Soviet Studebakers rolled into Berlin. American and British trucks crossed the Rhine, humming past German wrecks. Lend-Lease, costing $50 billion, delivered 152,000 trucks to the Soviet Union and tens of thousands to Britain, enabling relentless offensives. Standardized parts allowed rapid field repairs, often within hours. The constraint was systems. American production outpaced Germany's 52,000 trucks of 1943, most abandoned by 1945, starved of fuel and parts. Human effort turned industrial might into victory. A Soviet driver delivered shells to Berlin's edge, his Studebaker enduring where German trucks failed. A United States mechanic serviced a jeep with parts from a crate stamped Detroit. Germany's mechanics, facing empty workshops, abandoned broken Opel Blitzes as bombs fell. Allied air raids left synthetic fuel negligible by 1945, grounding Luftwaffe planes and stalling panzers. Repair times for German trucks stretched to days. The post-war world reflected this logistical edge. Lend-Lease, supplying 17% of Britain's materiel and 10% of the Soviet Union's, made the United States the arsenal of democracy, shaping Cold War divides. The number that matters is well over 600,000 vehicles, a metric that won the war and rebuilt Europe. A German officer, eyeing abandoned panzers, muttered, "Their trucks won." American standardization set a post-war industrial standard, while Germany's collapse showed conquest's limits without logistics.